An enhanced warrior gets onto a flight prepared to head home following quite a while of administration. However, when he attempts to take his seat in top-notch, the airline steward stops him cold. What occurs next will shock you, and it makes a huge difference for the carrier and its travelers. Before we begin the story, remark beneath and let us know where on earth you're watching from today, and in the event that you partake in this story, remember to buy in for more. Sergeant James Carter had quite recently wrapped up a long and tiresome 9-month organization abroad. Following quite a while of serving his country, he was anticipating a very much procured break, expecting just a quiet flight home. It wasn't his most memorable time, passing quickly. However, this trip felt different. He was depleted, genuinely, intellectually, sincerely, yet there was a positive feeling as he ventured into the air terminal prepared to get onto his flight. He was in uniform, his tactical ID swinging from his neck, and his top-notch ticket was an honor proposed to him as a feature of the aircraft's military appreciation program. James had forever been treated with deference while going in the past. The carrier staff typically recognized his administration with a grin, perhaps a well-mannered thank you. It was a little signal, however, one that had a significant effect after months spent in an unfamiliar land. As he moved toward the door, the boarding system was smooth and he immediately advanced down the fly scaffold toward the plane. He was anxious to sink into his seat, unwind, lastly get up to speed with rest. First class was where he was going. He had been overhauled as a piece of the tactical advantages presented by the carrier, and he was thankful for it. When he entered the plane, the airline steward, a lady in her mid-40s, remained close to the entry, welcoming travelers with a constrained grin. James welcomed her back graciously, and she requested to see his ticket. No issue, he thought as he gave it over. She took a fast look at it, gestured, and signaled for him to push toward the front of the plane. It was anything but a long walk in any case. It felt somewhat longer as he advanced past lines of seats, realizing that solace and rest looked for him anyway. Things were going to take a turn that he didn't expect. As he arrived at his doled-out seat in top-notch, the chaperone tone moved. She took a gander at him briefly, then said, "I'm sorry, sir, however this seat is not accessible for you." James was shocked. He gazed at her briefly, uncertain of what he had recently heard. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice low yet firm. The flight chaperone rehashed the same thing. "This seat isn't accessible for you." She didn't offer any further clarification, simply a chilly, pretentious look. James looked around. The lodge 5-star was essentially vacant. There were a lot of void seats. "I have a top-notch ticket," he said, his understanding starting to wear slim. "I'm in the tactical program. I was redesigned." However, the airline steward didn't appear to mind. She just shook her head. "I don't care about that. I need to request that you move to your doled-out seat in the back." James felt a blend of disarray and dissatisfaction working inside him. This shouldn't have been occurring. His top-notch ticket should be respected. He had served his country. He had procured this, but here he was being dealt with as he didn't have a place. Something wasn't correct. He attempted to remain quiet. "Could you at any point kindly check with the chief?" he asked, his voice now firmer, however still controlled. The airline steward didn't hold back. "No," she snapped. "Simply sit down in the back." James' heart sank. He had managed some impolite individuals in his day-to-day existence, however this felt different. He was a fighter in full uniform, and this lady was telling him to go demonstration the rear of the plane. Despite the fact that he had been redesigned, he was unable to comprehend it. His dissatisfaction was constructing. However, he chose not to raise what is going on at this time. He went to walk back to the mentors segment. However, at that point he halted. He glanced back at the vacant top-notch situates and realized he proved unable. Let this go. He pivoted and moved toward the orderly again, asking again to talk with the chief, yet her reaction was cold and her tone made it clear she won't move. James couldn't comprehend what had turned out badly. He was being deferential, yet this lady's activities felt profoundly off base, and something in him let him know he needed to defend himself. As the seconds ticked by, he acknowledged he won't go anyplace except if somebody in power stepped in, and that is the point at which the circumstance started to winding wild. James took a full breath, attempting to keep his level-headedness. He had been extreme circumstances before, yet this felt different. There was an unpleasant desire for the air, something about the airline steward's tone, her contemptuous mentality, and how she was treating him didn't sit right. He had been in endless air terminals, sat in a large number, 5-star situates, yet never had he gotten a handle on a greater amount of spot not in view of his uniform but sense of the reasonable dismissal for his status as a client, somebody who had procured this honor. He turned and started strolling rearward of the plane. However, the sensation of treachery gripped him. He could as of now feel the eyes of different travelers on him, some observing inquisitively, others awkwardly. Most were either as well-mannered or too scared to even consider making some noise. The airline steward was all the while remaining by the front, arms crossed, her eyes following him as he moved past the top of the line seats. She didn't much offer a statement of regret or a second look. She just remained there as though he were the person who was in some unacceptable. James advanced toward the rear of the plane, his brain dashing. He plunked down in his appointed seat in the economy class, yet he was unable to zero in on anything. The displeasure and disarray blended in with a feeling of embarrassment. He hadn't expected it was only a seat, yes, however it was about regard. His whole profession had been tied in with gaining appreciation both for him as well as his nation, and at the present time this lady was regarding him as though he didn't make any difference. He felt a significant burden on his chest. The airline stewards started their routine, going all over the paths. However, James could scarcely zero in on anything more. The unfairness of the circumstance continued to replay in his psyche. How was it that she could have done that? Why had she would not allow him to sit in the 5-star seat he was qualified for? It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the way he was being dealt with. He had no clue about the thing was going through her brain, yet a certain something was clear. He was unable to allow this to go unnoticed. So with a full breath and a feeling of resolve working in him, he stood up. He won't withdraw. He won't allow this lady to walk everywhere him and leave with a grin like nothing happened. He wasn't trying too hard to find something, he simply needed to be dealt with decently. He had been patient, however presently he expected to go to bat for himself. He moved rapidly to the front of the plane, his eyes looking for the chief. This time he won't ask. He planned to request a goal. When he came to the front, the airline steward gave him a hard look, didn't yet express anything, rather she dismissed, proceeding with her work as in the event that he weren't there. James glanced around, however there was no indication of the supervisor. He held up his heart beating. The minutes appeared to extend on perpetually, the strain in the air substantial. Planned to occur next. Was anybody going to take his side, or would this lady pull off her activities and afterwards similarly? As he started to lose trust, the entryway at the front of the plane opened and the director stepped in. The carrier supervisor, a moderately aged man with a flawlessly squeezed uniform and a quiet disposition, ventured onto the plane. James felt a glint of trust. At long last somebody with power. The airline steward, actually remaining close to the front, immediately moved toward him. She talked to him in a low rushed tone, yet James couldn't make out her words. Anything that she was saying, it didn't make any difference. He wasn't going to allow this to go without getting a fair goal. The director gestured as the airline steward highlighted James, then, at that point, went to take a gander at him. Their eyes met, and briefly James saw only impressive skill in the chief's look. He thought perhaps, quite possibly, this would be settled. However, at that point he saw the weak glimmer of something different in the supervisor's eyes, something that appeared to recommend he may side with the airline steward. "Is there an issue here, sir?" the supervisor asked, his tone courteous yet with a sprinkle of distance. James took a steadying breath prior to answering. "Yes, there is. This flight chaperone wouldn't allow me to sit in the top of the line seat that I've been moved up to. I have a substantial 5-star ticket, a piece of the tactical appreciation program. She let me know that seat wasn't accessible, and when I attempted to make sense of, she demanded I sit in the back." His voice was quiet, however there was an undeniable edge to it. "Now he won't withdraw." The director looked over at the airline steward, who was all the while standing solidly, her arms crossed. She wasn't talking now, yet her stance alone said a lot. The supervisor's face didn't change, be that as it may. James could see the cogwheels turning in his mind. There was a slight change in his demeanor, a snapshot of dithering. For a second James contemplated whether he planned to get the assistance he wanted, or on the other hand assuming this would turn out to be considerably more disappointing. After a long quiet the director turned his consideration back to James. "I see, let me mind that for you." His voice was smooth, however there was a briskness to it now. The manner in which he said it caused James to feel like he was the one creating problems, as though he were being nonsensical for expecting a top-notch seat. James could detect that the supervisor Wasn't precisely racing to fix what is happening. Thank you, James said, keeping his voice consistent, yet his understanding was diminishing. He looked as the supervisor strolled toward the cockpit region, presently not in sight. The airline steward, still remaining close to the front, gave James a muddled look. Maybe she was sitting tight for something, her arms crossed firmly, her position unbending. There was something agitating about her. However, James won't allow her terrorizing to get to him. Minutes passed. However, it felt like hours. James sat back in his seat, attempting to quiet his considerations. The minutes extended on, yet nobody returned. He looked around at different travelers, some of whom were watching the communication eagerly. A couple of travelers traded unsimple looks, yet nobody made some noise. It seemed like the entire lodge was pausing its breathing, standing by to witness what might next. Would the supervisor get back with an expression of remorse, or would James be compelled to sit unobtrusively in the back as though nothing had happened? Similarly, as he was beginning to totally become irritated, the chief returned. He strolled energetically down the path, his appearance now more serious, more engaged. This time he wasn't alone. The carrier's boss manager, a lady in a sharp suit, was strolling behind him. She was by all accounts there for reinforcement. This wasn't simply a normal circumstance any longer. Something was obviously being viewed more in a serious way now. James fixed up in his seat, preparing for what might come next. The pressure was thick, yet he had clarified that he wouldn't agree to anything short of the regard he merited. The chief and the manager moved toward James, and for the initial time the heaviness of the circumstance appeared to completely get comfortable. The boss' sharp eyes checked the region, rapidly taking in the scene. James could see she wasn't satisfied. She seemed like somebody who esteemed productivity, yet in addition somebody who figured out the significance of taking care of circumstances appropriately. Sergeant Carter, I'm exceptionally upset for the burden. The supervisor started, his voice currently inadequate with regards to the frigidity from previously. However, there was an unusual thing in his tone. It wasn't precisely sorry, simply a proper affirmation of the issue. I've spoken with our airline steward and I accept there's been a misconception. James didn't get it. The words felt practiced, like something he had heard before when organizations attempted to cover their tracks. A misconception, he rehashed, his voice quiet yet weighty with dissatisfaction. How is it a misconception when she would not allow me to sit in a seat I'm qualified for? I have my tactical ID and a 5-star ticket. I don't comprehend what's unclear about that. The supervisor moved his weight somewhat, a little indication of distress. He didn't promptly answer. The manager, who had hushed as of not long ago, at last talked. Sergeant Carter, let me guarantee you that we treat these issues in a serious way. We have strategies set up to guarantee all of our travelers are treated with deference, no matter what their experience or status. Her voice was firm, definitive, and it provided James with a promise of something better. She didn't seem like somebody who might endure out-of-line treatment anyway. The manager's next words shocked James tragically. We don't have a explicit military program that ensures top-notch updates in all cases. Everything you were said before could have been a miscommunication. James gazed at her, his dissatisfaction arriving at a limit. Miscommunication? Are you letting me know that I'm simply expected to acknowledge that I was deceived? I've flown with this carrier on various occasions before. I've been overhauled previously, and this isn't about a program, it's about fundamental regard. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, the outrage taking steps to bubble over. The boss' demeanor didn't change, yet the administrator moved awkwardly, plainly not ready for this degree of conflict. Sir, the supervisor contributed, we're putting forth a valiant effort to determine the issue. I've investigated your ticket and I can affirm that your update was for sure genuine. Anyway, I think there was a mistake with the seat task. He stopped, looking back at the chaperone, who was all the while remaining by the front, now with her arms firmly collapsed across her chest, looking more cautious than any other time in recent memory. The seat was accessible, however there was some disarray in our framework. James didn't really accept that briefly the seat was unfilled. The flight was not even close to full, and on the off chance that there had been a real issue, somebody ought to have clarified it for him, obviously from the beginning, not excuse him so inconsiderately. He felt like he was being faulted for the carrier's error, and it drove him mad. He wasn't simply being told to sit toward the rear of the plane any longer, he was being gaslighted. Before he could answer, the boss talked again, this time with a slight change in her tone. I comprehend your dissatisfaction, Sergeant, and I in all actuality do apologize for how this has been taken care of. Anyway, this present circumstance should be tended to in the appropriate manner. Her eyes flicked toward the airline steward who was currently standing a couple of speeds away watching the trade. Eagerly, "We will audit your activities and make suitable strides," the air developed. Weighty as James handled what she said, this wasn't just about the seat any longer. This was about an airline steward who had treated him unreasonably, somebody who had neglected to take care of her business appropriately. The carrier had neglected to deal with the circumstance all along, and presently they were attempting to turn it into something short of what it was. He really wanted to contemplate whether they would truly consider her responsible, or, in the event that this would all blow over, the quiet lingered palpably as James paused, watching the airline steward from the side of his eye. She actually hadn't communicated, and however her nonverbal communication told him all that he had to realize. She was tense, cautious, and obviously awkward. The inquiry was, would she be permitted to pull off it, or would somebody make a move? Then, as though on cue, the boss went to the supervisor and said something in a soft tone. The director gestured accordingly, and briefly the discussion appeared to move. James could feel something changing in the air. The manager strolled toward the flight chaperone, and that is when things veered off in an unexpected, strange direction. The boss moved toward the airline steward, who was all the while remaining close to the front, her arms firmly crossed, eyes fixed on the ground. She hadn't spoken since the director's appearance, yet presently as the manager contacted her, the pressure all around thickened. The supervisor stood a couple of speeds behind them, watching the communication intently, as though he were hanging tight for something to happen. James couldn't hear their discussion, however. The airline steward's stance hardened even further. Her hands, which had been apprehensively tinkering with the stitch of her uniform, were presently firmly held. She appeared to recoil under the boss' look, which just made James more dubious. The manager offered something, her voice quiet yet firm. Anything it was, it appeared to hit a nerve. The airline steward's articulation moved marginally. There was a blaze of outrage in her eyes, however she immediately concealed it with a constrained grin. The manager moved in the direction of James and gave him a short hush grin. "Sergeant, we've spoken with our flight specialist and we've tended to the circumstance inside. We will survey this matter further after the flight." Her voice was consistent, yet there was a basic hedge to maybe she realized this wasn't a straightforward misconception. James could feel the heaviness existing apart from everything else pushing down on him. He wasn't happy with simply a survey that was the corporate approach to hiding things where no one will think to look. He had previously invested sufficient energy attempting to account for himself. He had proactively been informed he was off base without anybody in any event paying attention to his side, yet there was something else now. The manager wasn't forgetting about him any longer. She had recognized the issue, and the flight chaperone's apprehensive energy wasn't lost on him. Still, he didn't let his watchman down. "What do you mean by audit? Are you going to simply allow her to pull off this?" James asked, his voice sharp now. He would not have been plated with a dubious reaction. He needed answers. The director, who had been standing quietly behind the boss, ventured forward. "Sergeant, I guarantee you that this will be viewed in a serious way. We'll be investigating the activities of the flight validate. Furthermore, I will buy guarantee that legitimate advances are taken." His tone was estimated, yet James could hear the weak sprinkle of anxiety sneaking in. James gazed at him, still unconvinced. "And what happens to her?" "She simply will return to her work in the wake of bringing this hardship." The director opened his mouth to answer, however the manager cut him off. "No, Sergeant, we view these issues in a serious way. We will be evaluating her direct, and assuming the examination finds that her activity were off the mark, will be there in no time. Flat results." Her words were more straightforward, as though she was at last assuming command over the circumstance. James' eyes restricted there. It was the principal affirmation that the airline steward activities could have been something beyond a slip-up. The manager's reaction clarified that something was being finished in the background, yet what did that truly mean? What outcomes would she face? Would it be sufficient to compensate for how he was dealt with? He didn't have the foggiest idea yet, for whenever he first felt like the circumstance was beginning to move in the correct bearing, the airline steward, as yet remaining out of the way, wasn't uttering a word. She hadn't apologized. What's more, she wasn't going to. Her quiet said a lot. James really wanted to keep thinking about whether she even acknowledged how serious the circumstance had turned into her absence of responsibility. Her refusal to concede her botch had now swelled into something far more terrible than an abnormal experience. The manager's words had clarified this wasn't simply a misconception, it was a disappointment of Amazing skill and it had results, Sergeant. I figure out your disappointment. The manager proceeded with, we will ensure what is happening is taken care of suitably. Thank you for your persistence. James remained there briefly, uncertain of what to say next. He wasn't feeling triumphant, not yet. However, there was a change in the air. Something was at long last being done. The airline steward's activities had been called out and she wasn't pulling off it, however, similarly as he was going to answer. The boss' tone turned out to be more serious, nearly cold. Anyway, she added, taking a gander at him strongly, this present circumstance is still under audit and until we complete that survey I can't give any further subtleties. James gripped his jaw. He wasn't going to leave things unresolved. I'll be expecting an update, he said, his voice low however firm. This isn't over. The boss gave a speedy gesture, yet James could perceive she won't make any commitments. He wasn't sufficiently gullible to think everything would be fixed right away. However, basically for the present it appeared as though somebody was at last taking obligation. As the discussion came to a nearby, James felt a blend of feelings: help that something was being finished, yet additionally a waiting feeling of outrage that it had taken such a long time to arrive. Yet this wasn't over by no stretch of the imagination. The circumstance was all the while fermenting underneath the surface, and James had the unmistakable inclination that it was going to detonate in a way nobody expected. As the manager dismissed, flagging the finish of their discussion, James couldn't shake the inclination that the circumstance wasn't completely settled. There was still excessively vulnerability lingering palpably. The airline steward actually remaining by the front of the lodge hadn't once looked him in the eye. Her quiet said a lot to him. It seemed like she was either as well pleased to apologize or excessively reluctant to concede any bad behavior one way or the other. Her way of behaving had put this entire circumstance into high gear, and James couldn't simply allow it to do without a reasonable goal. As the minutes passed, the pressure on the plane stayed thick, yet the flight progressed forward as though nothing had occurred. James got back to his seat, his contemplations dashing. The attendant stopped by with drinks before long. However, she didn't visually connect with him. She stayed away as though she were hesitant to communicate with him any further. The disquiet was tangible. James reclined in his seat, attempting to unwind. However, each time he shut his eyes his considerations snapped back to the manner in which he had been dealt with. He realized it wasn't simply about the seat any longer. It was about regard, something he acquired through long stretches of administration, something that had been denied to him for not a great explanation that hurt the most. He had been the one to move toward the airline steward pleasantly, to attempt to serenely make sense of the circumstance. However, it was he who had been excused and disregarded. He really wanted to replay the showdown to him the way she had taken a gander at him when he originally moved toward the seat, the cavalier tone, the manner in which she had demanded without even making sure that the seat wasn't accessible. It wasn't simply a misstep, it was anything but a mishap. It was an explicit refusal to treat him with the regard he merited today, refusal to try and pay attention to his clarification, and that was something he wouldn't simply disregard. A couple of additional minutes passed, yet nobody came to keep an eye on him. Nobody apologized, not so much as a straightforward affirmation of the distress he'd got through. The airline stewards went about their obligations, moving around the lodge, yet the feeling of strain remained. It was as assuming that everybody was simply imagining everything was ordinary, trusting the occurrence would blow over. James looked around the front of the lodge again. He could see the airline steward remaining by the kitchen conversing with another group part. She looked loosened up now, like she had gotten back to her standard obligations, yet there was something about the manner in which she held herself that appeared to be not exactly right. There was no touch of regret, no acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. James had seen enough in his vocation to know when things were being hidden where no one will think to look. This felt like one of those circumstances the aircraft needed to determine it, rapidly move past it, and trust the travelers would forget about it. However, he proved unable. Not this time. He held up a little longer. However, the flight didn't appear to be dialing back in any capacity. The smooth murmur of the motors and a periodic prattle from different travelers caused the entire experience to feel like ancient history. Yet inside, James couldn't give up. His psyche was still on the trade. The way he had been excused, the manner in which the airline steward had embarrassed him before everybody. He couldn't simply sit there and remain as optimistic as possible. He really wanted answers. It was only after the plane started its plummet that things at long last took one more turn. The seatbelt sign came on and the lodge lights diminished, flagging that they were approaching their objective. At that point, the airline steward moved toward his seat. This time there was No eye-to-eye connection at all. She just remained there quietly, trusting that James will affix his safety belt. Her presence was awkward, off-kilter, yet there was something different now too, an unpretentious change in her stance. The certainty that she had before in the flight appeared to have dissipated, supplanted by a calm, apprehensive energy. James gazed at her briefly, thinking about the choice about whether to talk. There were so many things he could say, however he didn't know whether it would have an effect. Rather, he basically gestured and agreed, tying himself in. Yet as she continued on toward the following column, he couldn't resist the opportunity to think about the thing planned to occur. Presently the plane landed without occurrence, yet the strain and the lodge waited as travelers accumulated their effects. James stood up. Social affair, his things, his eyes still on the airline steward. She was occupied assisting travelers with recovering their packs from the above receptacles. However, there was no endeavor at eye-to-eye connection, no affirmation of the connection they had recently shared. Maybe it hadn't even occurred, as though the situation had just been a blip on the radar for her. Yet for James it was a long way from being done. As the plane reached a standstill and the commander's voice came over the radio, James remained in the passageway, trusting that the entryways will open. The airline steward started to plan for disembarkation, and as James pushed toward the leave, he saw the manager remaining by the entryway chatting with another group. The manager's eyes met his as he strolled toward the entryway, and interestingly that day James felt a glint of something that could look like responsibility. Yet was it enough? Would the carrier make a genuine move, or would this simply be one more failed to remember occurrence hid where no one will think to look? By the powers that be, the main thing James knew without a doubt was that this wasn't the last time anybody would catch wind of what occurred. The wheels of equity, delayed as they may be, were at last starting to turn. However, how far would they go? The truth would surface eventually as James ventured off the plane and into the clamoring terminal. The heaviness of the circumstance actually weighted. He moved through the horde of travelers feeling an odd blend of help and disappointment, alleviation that the experience was over for the present in any event, yet dissatisfaction since he realized something must be finished. This couldn't simply be ignored like such countless different circumstances he'd found in his vocation, the abuse, the need of responsibility. It wasn't correct and he won't let it go. He didn't have the foggiest idea what might occur next. The manager had said they would audit the airline steward activities, yet he had heard corporate talk like that before. Vows to audit and examine generally implied the issue would get covered and everybody would continue on with their personal business. Yet James couldn't shake the feeling that something more was in question here. It wasn't just about a top-notch seat, it was about the rule of regard, and that rule had been disregarded, such that won't vanish on the grounds that the flight had landed securely. James advanced toward baggage carousel, where he snatched his sack off the transport line and afterwards stopped gazing at the group moving around him. He really wanted to consider the number of others that had been dealt with along these lines in manners, large or little, that they had recently let slide. The airline steward's conduct hadn't been an accident, it had been purposeful, and more regrettable, it had been a sign of something more profound, a mentality that an excessive number of individuals in influential places had while managing others, particularly individuals like him, individuals in uniform, individuals who served their nation. However, James would not have been quiet about this. He was unable to be. He was presently not simply the trooper on the flight, he was somebody who had seen the framework flop endlessly time once more, and he wasn't going to let this be simply one of those cases. As he left the terminal and ventured out into the fresh air, he took out his telephone. The primary thing he did was gaze upward. The carrier's client assistance number, assuming he planned to find any genuine solutions. It depended on him to ensure they were considered responsible. He didn't know what the following stage would be. Nevertheless, he realized he needed to completely finish before he dialed the number. His telephone hummed with a new warning. It was an email, and the headline grabbed his eye promptly. Significant update in regards to your new involvement and carrier name. It was from the aircraft, and despite the fact that he had no clue about what it could say, he opened it inquisitive. The email began with a conventional statement of regret, the sort that organizations generally send when there's a protest. We Lament that your new involvement in aircraft name didn't fulfill our guidelines of administration. However, at that point it got more unambiguous. The email referenced the episode on his flight and expressed that they had made a prompt move to address the circumstance. Inside there was likewise a concise notice of a continuous examination. However, what stood apart was the last line: because of this episode the airline steward included has been suspended awaiting additional analysis. James halted briefly, his finger drifting over the screen. Suspended, that was a beginning. It was anything but an expression of remorse. It wasn't the sort of goal he had expected, yet it was something affirmation he had never expected. Quick responses, yet seeing that the aircraft had made some move caused him to feel as was there still an opportunity for something genuine to happen. To this he plunked down on a close-by seat handling the email. It wasn't wonderful, it was anything but a full goal. However, it was a stage he was unable to let his watchman down presently. However, the email referenced that the examination was all the while continuous, which implied the airline steward's suspension was transitory. James realized the organization could constantly decide to discreetly re-establish her on the off chance that they concluded the matter wasn't quite so serious as it appeared, yet he won't allow that to happen, not easily. He took a full breath and settled on the decision to client care as he was required to be postponed. He audited everything to him: the flight, the showdown, the supervisor's commitments and the manager's words. He didn't know where this call would lead. However, he realized it was significant. This wasn't just about a seat any longer, it was tied in with considering the carrier responsible for how they took care of the circumstance and ensuring that no one else would go through what he had. When somebody at last picked up the telephone, James started smoothly making sense of his experience, trying to focus on what's relevant. He talked about how he had been treated, how the airline steward wouldn't allow him to sit in that frame of mind in spite of his substantial 5-star ticket, and how the aircraft had misused the circumstance all along. The client assistance delegate tuned in without interference, and when James completed there was a long respite on the opposite end. "I apologize, sir," the agent said, his voice true. "We treat these issues extremely in a serious way, and I'll ensure this is raised to the right group." James couldn't shake the inclination that it was simply one more standard reaction. However, basically this individual wasn't attempting to close him down. He rehashed the significance of holding the airline stewards responsible of ensuring that the organization finished their guarantees. The delegate guaranteed him they would do exactly that. As the call finished, James sat back, his psyche actually dashing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wheels were moving, yet he realized the genuine work was simply starting. The aircraft's reaction was only the beginning, and he won't rest until he owned it. Interestingly, since the episode, James felt a feeling of control. This wasn't a battle he planned to lose. This wasn't what is happening that could simply be hidden away from plain view. He had been slighted, yet not set in stone. To ensure that lack of regard was perceived and tended to the reality of the situation was he wasn't only battling for himself, he was battling for any individual who had at any point been excused, disregarded, or abused, and this time it would not have been failed to remember. The following couple of days were a haze for James. The underlying shock of the episode had worn off. However, the dissatisfaction waited stewing underneath the surface. He had done all that he could to push the carrier for answers, yet presently he was in a brief delay, just standing by to witness what might next. Each time his telephone rang he got it rapidly, trusting it was a report on the circumstance, yet all he got were robotized messages, client care reactions, and a periodic obscure affirmation that the examination was all the while continuous. He had no clue about how long the interaction would take. It very well may be days, weeks, or even a long time before he got any genuine conclusion. Yet one thing was sure: the more he contemplated it, the furious he turned into. This wasn't simply a slip-up, it was a fundamental issue. The flight orderly's conduct, her unmitigated negligence for his status as a help part, wasn't simply a disconnected episode. It was an impression of something more profound, something imbued in the manner the carrier worked. James realized this wasn't just about him. He wasn't the one in particular who had at any point been abused. He wasn't the one in particular who had at any point been excused, disregarded, or treated unreasonably due to his uniform. There were different fighters, others who had gone with the aircraft, who could have been exposed to comparative treatment. They simply hadn't uttered a word. He knew that, and it drove him to keep pushing for equity for himself as well as for any individual who had at any point been dealt with the same way. 7 days after the fact, James got One more email from the aircraft, and this time it was different. The headline perused: last update Gulliver. Ongoing occurrence. James delayed the slightest bit prior to opening it. His heart beat as he tapped on the message. The email began with another conciliatory sentiment, yet this time it was more unambiguous. It made sense of that after a careful survey of the airline steward's activities, the carrier had chosen to end her business taking effect right now. The email likewise incorporated a point-by-point breakdown of the examination cycle, expressing that meetings had been directed with different travelers and group individuals who had seen the occurrence. The carrier guaranteed James that they had viewed the matter in a serious way and that they would keep on focusing on client support and regard for all travelers. Pushing ahead, James felt a blend of feelings wash over him. A player in him was feeling better at long last. The carrier had done something unequivocal. The airline steward would as of now not have the option to treat anybody the manner in which she had treated him. Yet another a piece of him felt uncomfortable. The circumstance had raised so rapidly and the outcomes were serious. Unemployment lost, a standing discolored, all as a result of a solitary collaboration. James didn't believe anybody should lose their work, yet he likewise realized that her activities had crossed a line there was no returning from that. Still, the goal felt like a triumph regardless of whether it came for an extreme price. James had battled for regard and in the end he had gotten it. Yet more than that, he had constrained the carrier to stand up to its own imperfections. They could never again take cover behind corporate language and void commitments. They had been compelled to settle on a difficult choice, and that was something he could live with. A couple of days after the fact, he got an individual call from the carrier's client relations chief. It was the initial time somebody from the organization had connected to him straightforwardly. The supervisor said thanks to him for his understanding in the interim. Furthermore, repeated that the organization was focused on giving a superior encounter to its travelers. He too offered James a free round-trip as a token of generosity. James didn't know what to say. He wasn't keen on free flights. What he truly needed was responsibility, and in some way he had gotten that. The administrator talked with earnestness, and for the first time James felt like the aircraft was truly attempting to make things right. He valued the motion, yet it wasn't the flight that made a difference. What made a difference was that the carrier had at last made the best choice. As the call finished, James put down his telephone and sat peacefully. Briefly, it had been a long excursion from the second he had ventured onto that plane to the displeasure and disappointment he had felt, to the inevitable goal that had come after such a lot of delay and perseverance. It had removed a ton from him, yet in the end he realized he had made a distinction. He had defended himself and for the numerous other people who may in all likelihood never have stood up. James watched out the window, looking as the sun set. The world outside hushed up serene. However, he realized that things had changed for him as well as for the aircraft, for the airline steward, and for anybody who could confront disregard in the future. The battle wasn't finished, however it was a step in the right direction, and that to him was enough. For presently, as the days went by, James couldn't shake the inclination that this entire circumstance had transformed him in manners he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the seat any longer. The more he considered it, the more he understood that the quarrel had become over something a lot greater, about going to bat for regard, responsibility, and the thought that individuals in strategic, influential places ought to treat others with respect no matter what their position, appearance, or foundation. It had been difficult to remain patient during those long periods of holding up the ever-changing messages, the dubious confirmations from client care. Everything felt like a corporate shell game intended to keep him diverted while they continued on toward the following issue, and there were minutes when he questioned whether the carrier would truly keep their word. After all, they could without much of a stretch disregard him and imagine like the circumstance never happened. He had witnessed that too often before, where organizations set up of an ear of mindful at the end of the day never really resolved the main problems. However, at that point came that last email, the one that affirmed the flight participation, and it was difficult to accommodate the reality that somebody had lost their employment in view of a cooperation that had begun as a basic misconception. James didn't feel better about it, and yet he knew there could have been no other choice. The airline steward had neglected to take care of her business and had treated him in a manner that was totally unsatisfactory. No measure of corporate twofold talk could delete that. And didn't simply address a triumph for James, it was an indication that the carrier had been compelled to confront the revolting truth of how a portion of its representatives acted. The organization had no real option except to consider somebody responsible that was a success in itself. Still, a piece of him felt uncomfortable. Individuals' lives shouldn't have been thrown to the side so rapidly. It made him can't help thinking about the number of other airline stewards or staff individuals had committed comparative errors. How frequently travelers like him had been dealt with ineffectively in little apparently irrelevant ways that nobody at any point knows. Saw the call from the carrier's client relations director had been a smart idea. However, it didn't change the way that something had turned out badly. In any case, the supervisor had offered his statements of regret, and keeping in mind that they appeared to be authentic, James really wanted to feel that they were likewise inspired by a longing to close the case rapidly and continue on. Offering him a free round-trip flight appeared to be an endeavor to streamline things. However, James didn't need gifts, he needed regard. He would have rather not to be a symbolic motion or a reconsideration. He had been dealt with unjustifiably, and the cost of that wasn't something that could be eradicated by a flight voucher. However, he was unable to reject that in an unusual manner the cycle had woken him up to the significance of going to bat for oneself. Before this, James had forever been a calm-saved individual. Substance to continue on ahead without causing disturbances. He consistently kept his head down, zeroing in on his work, his administration, and his obligations. Yet presently he understood that quietness wasn't consistently the response. Now and again you needed to shout out. Some of the time you needed to make clamor. He had discovered that the most difficult way possible, yet in doing so he had constrained change for himself as well as for other people who could confront a similar circumstance later on. Even after the end, even after the conciliatory sentiment, James realized the story wasn't around. There were still inquiries left unanswered. The aircraft had made a move, indeed, yet how might they guarantee that something like this wouldn't reoccur? Was it only one rotten one, or was there a more profound issue inside the organization's way of life that permitted this sort of treatment to occur? In any case, James didn't have every one of the responses. In any case, he realized that this wasn't what is going on. He could essentially fail to remember it wasn't just about considering one individual responsible. It was tied in with pushing for change, ensuring that the carrier and maybe others in the business really investigated how they treated their clients, particularly the people who served in the tactical. He contemplated different travelers on that flight. Had any of them seen what happened? Had they seen the airline steward's refusal to allow him to sit in the top-notch seat? The manner in which she had treated him with such hatred he hadn't anticipated anybody to go to bat for him. It wasn't the sort of thing that typically drew consideration, particularly on a packed flight. Yet, he understood that despite the fact that he had felt alone at the time he wasn't, there were endless other people who had presumably been in comparative circumstances, feeling neglected or slighted. Perhaps they hadn't uttered a word, perhaps they hadn't overemphasized it. However, that didn't mean they hadn't taken note. James realized that when individuals were quiet, it didn't mean they didn't mind, it just implied they were sitting tight for another person to shout out, and that was where he came in. By supporting himself he had allowed others to do a similar. He didn't have the foggiest idea how this story would end. However, he had begun a discussion, and that was the most important phase in changing the way of life both at the carrier and then some. In the weeks that followed he kept on circling back to the aircraft, guaranteeing they stayed true to their promise and carried out the transforms they guaranteed. He clarified that he wasn't disappearing until he saw the full picture. He wasn't simply one more disappointed traveler who needed a convenient solution. He needed responsibility. He needed change. Each time he connected he was met with additional affirmations that the carrier was chipping away at it. However, James wasn't going to let them free. He was patient yet determined, and he would keep on being until he got results. It wasn't just about the airline steward any longer. It was tied in with ensuring that individuals like him, individuals who had procured their place, couldn't have ever to encounter that sort of discourtesy again, whether it was the carrier or the world at large. James realized that his battle wasn't done with. This was simply starting. As the days extended into weeks, the heaviness of what had happened started to settle further into James' psyche. The circumstance with the airline steward, the awkward showdown, the series of messages and calls. Everything felt like ancient history on occasion, yet in alternate ways it was still especially alive. It wasn't simply the goal he had looked for, it was simply the interaction that had turned into the defining moment for him. He had anticipated some conclusion, a tranquil statement of regret, a standard reaction, yet what he had gotten was something undeniably more significant, an encounter that would change how he saw himself and how he moved toward the world. James hadn't been a vocal individual all through his military vocation. He had been somebody who liked to deal with things all alone, discreetly and expertly. In the event that there was an issue, he managed it, and on the off chance that it wasn't something he could fix, he continued on. However, the episode on that flight had driven him into new domain. It had constrained him to talk up to battle for something greater than simply his seat on the plane. It was about his poise, his administration, and at last the regard he merited as an officer as well as an individual. The aircraft had been helpful somewhat, yet James couldn't shake the inclination that they were just doing the absolute minimum to determine the issue. Yes, the airline steward had been terminated, and indeed the carrier had vowed to improve from now on, yet James wasn't keen on corporate consolations or void commitments. He had perceived how effectively organizations could turn what is happening, make a handy solution, and afterward continue on without transforming anything authentic. He won't allow them to pull off that, not this time. So he continued to push. He sent follow-up messages requesting more subtleties on the examination, squeezing for data on what steps the aircraft was taking to guarantee such episodes didn't reoccur. He got some information about their preparation processes for representatives, about how they dealt with grumblings, about how they planned to encourage a culture of regard for all travelers, particularly the individuals who served in the tactical. He was steady, yet in a manner he knew that in the event that he didn't keep the tension on, nothing would change. And then one day all of a sudden he got a call. It was from the client relations chief again, yet this time the tone of the discussion was different. The administrator was done. Contribution, dubious consolations. This time he was addressing James as though they were rises to, as though they were both accomplices in a discussion about genuine change. Sergeant Carter, the chief said, "We've been standing by listening to your criticism, and I need to thank you for your perseverance. We've checked on our inward systems, and I'm glad to illuminate you that we've chosen to carry out a company-wide preparing drive centered on variety, regard, and military appreciation." James was shocked. He had expected the standard corporate language. However, this was different. The organization was not simply saying sorry, they were making a substantial move. The chief made sense of that. Following the occurrence, the carrier had led a full survey of its staff preparing programs, especially in how representatives connected with military staff. They were wanting to carry out new preparation for all airline stewards and client administration staff, zeroing in on social responsiveness, figuring out the special necessities of military individuals, and cultivating a more prominent feeling of regard and impressive skill in all cooperations. James felt a glint of something he hadn't expected. Trust. He had pushed for change, and presently it was occurring. It wasn't just about the airline steward any longer. It was tied in with ensuring that each warrior, each individual who had served their nation, would be treated with the regard they merited by this carrier as well as by others too. The supervisor kept to let James know that the carrier was likewise laying out an immediate line for military staff to report any episodes or concerns they looked during their movements. They were making a framework where fighters, veterans, and their families could make some noise unafraid of being disregarded or dismissed. It was a little step, however James could feel the heaviness of it. This was certainly not a symbolic signal, it was a genuine endeavor to make things right. For the first time James felt like he was being heard. The call finished with a greeting for James to meet with the carrier senior authority group to talk about the progressions face to face and to give his contribution on how the aircraft could keep on further developing. He concurred. However, a piece of him was still in dismay. A significant organization was as a matter of fact requesting his perspective, treating his involvement with a serious way. As the gathering drew nearer, James ended up considering the excursion that had driven him here. He had been simply one more traveler on a flight, giving his all to return home after a long organization. However, in the range of half a month he had gone from feeling slighted and excused to turning into a voice for change inside a large company. It was a surprising result, yet it was one that had taken assurance, constancy, and an eagerness to stand up when it made a difference. Upon the arrival of the gathering, James, wearing his uniform, the heaviness of his military experience choosing his shoulders as he strolled into the carrier's corporate base camp, He was met by a little gathering of chiefs generally anxious to hear his considerations. They were sorry again for the episode, yet this time their words felt real. They weren't simply scratching off a box. They were listening, they were posing inquiries, taking notes, and showing a readiness to comprehend what had turned out badly. James gone through the following couple of hours conversing with them, sharing his experience exhaustively and giving ideas on how they could guarantee that this didn't repeat. He enlightened them concerning the significance of regard, about how little emotions could have a major effect, about how a carrier could show its appreciation for military individuals without it seeming like a symbolic motion. He let them know that they expected to accomplish something other than apologize. They expected to make military appreciation part of their organization culture, something implanted in all that they did from preparing to client administration. Toward the gathering's end, James felt a feeling of satisfaction he hadn't expected. The chiefs were really keen on making transforms. They requested his proceeded with association, and James consented to assist them with keeping focused, to sincerely commit to sure that the responsibilities they had made would be something other than words on paper. He would have rather not simply been a section of the story. He needed to guarantee the story was all the while being written in a manner that would matter for quite a long time into the future. When James left the base camp that day, he really wanted to feel a deep satisfaction. It had been a long street loaded up with disappointment and uncertainty, yet in the end he had an effect. The organization had tuned in and they were making a move. However, all the more significantly, he had gotten the hang of something important to him. He had discovered that occasionally defending what's right takes something other than standing up. It takes constancy, tolerance, and the boldness to push through in any event when the chances appear to be stacked against you. James had begun this excursion wanting to get a goal for himself. However, in the end he had made something a lot greater. He had helped set another standard, one where regard was presently not discretionary, and where everybody, no matter their experience, could rely on being treated with nobility, and that he knew was a triumph worth battling for. In the weeks that followed his gathering with the aircraft's senior authority, James couldn't resist the opportunity to consider exactly how much his life had changed since that critical flight. What had begun as a straightforward and in numerous ways disrupting experience had spiraled into something far bigger than he might have envisioned. What he had thought would be a fleeting fight over a 5-star seat had transformed into an out-and-out crusade for change, not just inside the carrier, yet in addition inside the more extensive setting of how military staff are treated by organizations and the general population at huge. James had gone through years in the tactical comprehension, the force of discipline, request, and regard. However, he had never truly contemplated how that regard ought to convert into the world past the military, particularly in regular citizen spaces like carriers and or retail organizations. The episode had opened his eyes to a more profound issue that many troopers confronted yet seldom discussed: the unobtrusive types of discourtesy that went inconspicuous to a great many people. It wasn't generally about significant episodes like being dismissed at the entryway or denied administration, however, about the little slippery minutes that caused administration individuals to feel not exactly as though were some way or another undeserving of the regard they should be. Qualified for the criticism he got from the aircraft after the gathering, the substantial activities they were taking were something beyond an individual triumph. They were verification that change was conceivable when individuals were able to stand up and request it, and for James that was sufficient to cause him to feel like he hadn't simply been battling for his own respect, he had been battling for the poise of innumerable other people who had been oppressed to comparable abuse while never having opportunity to voice their disappointments. He could feel a calm sense of pride working inside him, realizing that his activities had ignited a gradually expanding influence that could end up being useful to have an impact on the way organizations collaborated with a tactical local area. One evening a month later, the goal, he was sitting at home when he got one more email from the carrier. This time it was anything but a corporate correspondence or a conciliatory sentiment. It was a challenge to be important for a center gathering they were sorting out. They maintained that James should assist with molding the eventual fate of their tactical appreciation arrangements. It was obvious from the greeting that they had rolled out the improvements he had mentioned. However, presently they maintained that his contribution on how might make the experience far and away superior for military voyagers pushing ahead. It wasn't simply empty talk. The carrier was effectively requesting his recommendation, showing a guarantee to roll out genuinely enduring improvements. The gathering meeting was set for half a month after the fact, and James had blended sentiments about it. Valued the motion, however. Some portion of him contemplated whether it was simply one more way for the carrier to mark a container anyway. He likewise grasped that genuine change frequently took time, and the way that they were all the while connecting for input implied that they were in any event focused on improving. When the day of the center gathering showed up, James regarded himself as in a gathering room with a few other military veterans. They came from various branches, foundations and regions of administration, however totally shared one normal experience. They had been dealt with unjustifiably sooner or later during their movements. Some had been denied redesigns, others had been neglected by client support staff, and many had been exposed to unobtrusive predispositions or generalizations. James listened intently as they shared their accounts. It was striking the number of their encounters reflected his own cases of being dealt with like an untimely idea, excused or even disregarded. The center gathering was more than simply a gathering. It turned into a soothing encounter for everybody required. For James it was an opportunity to acknowledge exactly the amount of an aggregate issue this truly was. The abuse wasn't simply one secluded occasion. It was important for an example that had impacted military individuals in various ways over the long run. Hearing different veterans talk about their own encounters caused him to feel less detached. It wasn't just around one individual shouting out, it was about a local area meeting up to request the regard they merited. The gathering went on for a few hours, and toward the finish of it James felt a feeling of trust he hadn't anticipated. The aircraft leaders present took notes, angrily posing inquiries, offering clarifications, and in any event, conceding that they had never completely perceived the profundity of the issues looked by military staff. They were truly locked in. What's more, as the gathering slowed down, they asked the gathering for substantial ideas on the best way to further develop their administration. It wasn't pretty much giving them a conciliatory sentiment any longer. It was tied in with offering unmistakable arrangements. James made some noise recommending that the carrier make a devoted helpline for military faculty, a way for them to contact client support rapidly. Furthermore, straightforwardly, without making sense of their circumstance over and over. He moreover suggested that the carrier work all the more intimately with veterans associations to guarantee their strategies lined up with the necessities of the tactical local area. Yet the main idea question he made was basic: treat each fighter, each veteran like they matter, since they do. He additionally accentuated that the changes should have been reflected in the organization's way of life, not simply in their strategies. A program can go up until this point, he said. Individuals matter. When an airline steward is strolling down the path and sees a warrior in uniform, they ought to feel a deep satisfaction, not simply obligation. They ought to know that what they do has real meaning. The regard needs to come starting from the top, and it must be felt at each level of the organization. The gathering finished strong, with the aircraft leaders saying thanks to the veterans for their time and input. As James left the gathering room, he felt something he hadn't expected, a feeling of achievement, not so much for himself yet for individuals who might follow him. The progressions they were dealing with were something other than arrangements. They were about making a social shift. It wasn't just about obliging military faculty, it was tied in with valuing them for the penances they had made, understanding the extraordinary difficulties they confronted, and causing them to feel regarded and esteemed constantly. Soon thereafter the carrier made a public declaration about the new strategies they had executed. It wasn't simply a press discharge, it was a promise to change upheld by activities and drives that sounds carried out throughout the following couple of months. The carrier had collaborated with military associations to send off a cross-country mindfulness crusade about the significance of approaching military staff with deference and pride. They likewise presented another Veterans Need program offering veterans and deployment-ready military faculty admittance to need seating, early boarding, and a committed client support line. For James the mission was the perfection of all that he had battled for. It wasn't just around one disengaged occurrence, it was tied in with guaranteeing that no warrior on Earth might have to feel the manner in which he had felt on that flight again. The genuine change had come not simply in the aircraft's approaches yet in the mentality of individuals who worked there. They were at long last beginning to see military workforce not as an exceptional case but rather as esteemed citizenry who merit a similar regard as some other client. As he paused for a moment and pondered how far things had come, James understood that the battle wasn't finished. However, interestingly, in a drawn-out period of time he felt confident the change they had worked for was at last occurring, and that was a value thing. Battling for the excursion he had begun with a solitary grumbling had developed into something a lot greater, and it had the potential to significantly impact ages of military faculty to come. The fight had been long, yet the triumph was worth the effort, and James knew with a profound feeling of fulfillment that the venture was a long way from being done. As the months passed, the progressions James had pushed for started to take repetition. The carrier's new military appreciation program was gradually building up forward momentum, and keeping in mind that it was still a work in progress, plainly things were further developing. Veterans and deployment-ready staff who went with the carrier were beginning to see the advantages firsthand. James kept on keeping in contact with the aircraft, checking in on the advancement of the drives, offering guidance and, surprisingly, taking part in a couple of more center gatherings. It was turning out to be certain that the organization was significant about its obligation to change, and James really wanted to feel a developing feeling of satisfaction in what they had achieved together. The effect wasn't just bound to the carrier. Different organizations started to consider what was going on, and James got himself handling calls and messages from organizations across different ventures requesting counsel on the best way to move along their own strategies for military faculty. It was an expanding influence that James hadn't guessed. What had begun as a solitary occurrence, exclusive's dissatisfaction over being dealt with unreasonably, had changed into a bigger development, one that called for regard, appreciation, furthermore, responsibility for the individuals who had served. James realized that change was once in a while prompt. It required investment for new strategies to turn out to be completely imbued in an organization's way of life. However, he likewise knew that he had ignited something strong, something that couldn't be quickly scattered. The excursion hadn't been simple. Also, it had tried him in manners he hadn't expected, yet the outcome settled everything. More carriers, more organizations, more individuals were beginning to perceive the benefit of regarding military faculty. It wasn't just about making an incidental motion, it was tied in with building a culture of regard that would keep going for ages, and the most fulfilling part, a great many military staff who would profit from the progressions. James could as of now hear the accounts of fighters, veterans and their families voyaging all the more effectively, feeling regarded and realizing that their administration was valued in a manner it never had been before. The little triumphs were including. It wasn't simply the huge organizations or the high-profile programs, it was the seemingly insignificant details: a trooper strolling into an air terminal and being welcomed with deference, a veteran getting an overhauled seat without asking, a family voyaging together not feeling like they needed to battle for fundamental conveniences. These were the things James had battled for, and presently they were turning into a reality for James. The work was never genuinely completed. There was continuously more to be accomplished, other things, ways of improving, and more individuals to reach, yet the sensation of progress was certain. He had seen the carrier change, seen the way they saw their obligation to military workforce shift, and he knew that regardless of whether he wasn't generally at the front of the development, his effect would be felt for quite a while. Like clockwork, James strolled through an air terminal or loaded onto a flight. He saw the little changes: airline stewards welcoming military staff with more regard, the unobtrusive however recognizable contrast in the manner individuals collaborated with officers in uniform. It was a tranquil shift, however it was one that had a significant effect. As he remained at the entryway for one more flight one day, James glanced around at the other traveler, a slight grin pulling at the side of his lips. This wasn't the world he had experienced childhood and where warriors like him were much of the time neglected or disregarded. It was a world where regard was the gauge, where organizations like this aircraft were at long last perceiving the penances made by the people who served, and that to him was a triumph. He wasn't simply a trooper any longer, he was an impetus for change, an individual who had seen an issue, battled for it, and in the end assisted make the world a tad with bettering, and that sensation of having had an effect was something that would remain with him long after the story had blurred from the titles. The days after the goal, a war calmer, more intelligent James got back to his routine, to the work and life that had characterized him before this occurrence had started such a sensational chain of occasions. In any case, presently there was a feeling of direction that had been added to his everyday existence. His activities, regardless of how little they appeared at the time, had undulated outward in manners that would proceed to influence others. The regard that had been denied to him and to so many others like him was gradually being re-established by the aircraft as well as by the bigger corporate world, and maybe even by society at large. James won't ever anticipate to be the substance of a development, yet in a manner that is precisely exact thing had happened. It wasn't about popularity or acknowledgement. He wasn't keen on awards or applause, however. It was about the little tranquil triumphs that accompanied realizing that his activities had added to something greater. It was about the families he had helped, the troopers who might feel more regarded, and the change he had touched off. Where before regard had been a reconsideration. As he sat in his residing room one night considering all that had happened, James couldn't resist the opportunity to feel a feeling of satisfaction. The battle had been long, and it had now and again felt like it wasn't worth the effort. There had been snapshots of uncertainty, minutes where he didn't know whether his endeavors would prompt anything by any means, yet presently, thinking back plainly, it had been worth each ounce of energy. The carrier had changed its strategies as well as assisted with moving the discussion on how military staff ought to be treated across ventures. Different organizations had followed suit, carrying out their own projects for veterans and well-trained individuals, and the culture of regard impact that James had battled for was starting to take repetition gradually yet consistently across the country. James realized that change was never wonderful, it wasn't momentary, and it didn't necessarily look the manner in which you anticipated that it should, yet change had worked out, and that was enough for him. He had battled for himself as well as for the up-and-coming age of troopers and veterans, for the people who might load up trips later on, who might stroll into stores and eateries and be treated with the poise they merited. And however the street ahead was still lengthy, James knew that the excursion had been worth the effort. The most recent couple of months had shown him something he hadn't completely perceived previously. In some cases the best triumphs come not from the fights you hope to win, but rather from the ones you never saw coming. Furthermore, for James that acknowledgement was all the conclusion he wanted in the end. It wasn't just about a flight, it was about a development, a second that had begun. However, with one straightforward demonstration of lack of regard, however, had transformed into something a lot bigger than any of them had envisioned, and the world would continue to turn. The progressions he had made would reverberate a long ways past that solitary occurrence James had won. However, more critically, he had ensured that the world would be somewhat better for the individuals who might come after him, and that to him was a definitive triumph. On the off chance that you track down this story, fascinating, make a point to stir things up around town button and offer your contemplations in the remarks underneath. Remember to buy in to the channel for additional recordings like this. Gratitude for observing.